Good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all, and welcome into today's lesson. This is a recording for a lesson that's going to be given in class. So if you are absent or if you would like to review the lesson at any time, please do so in this Canvas discussion space. The learning objectives for this lesson encompass a lot of the things we're focusing on specific to English 126. So please, as we begin, make sure that you have your slide handouts and use this document as a place to annotate, highlight, and make your own notes along the course of the lesson. Trying to maybe paraphrase some of the voiceover material into your own words, or a space to jot down questions you'd like to ask during or after the lesson, or a space to jot down notes about how you might be looking for these specific rhetorical strategies in the discourse community that you are researching. As always, if you are the note-taking ambassador for this assignment, don't feel pressured to copy down everything that you see and hear during the lesson. Instead, just use your discretion to take down the most important, interesting, or meaningful details that you can share out with the course, with your classmates. With that said, let's jump in. In this lesson, we're going to begin by taking a look at what the meaning of rhetorical appeal, rhetorical strategy, rhetorical device is. Then we're going to break it down into the three major categories: appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos. And then a final reflection on what does that mean for us as critical readers, critical writers. So a reminder again, please do take notes along the way. Engage in active learning practices. Don't assume that just because the teacher is teaching, learning is going to happen. It does involve some engagement on your part along the way. So let's jump right in. First of all, what is rhetorical appeal? So rhetoric in general is the stylized use of language in which the speaker or writer intends to influence the audience's ideas about or attitudes toward the topic under discussion. So using language in a stylized way to influence your audience is the general categorical definition of rhetoric. And within rhetoric, we can specify and classify types of rhetorical appeal. So each type of rhetorical appeal is a specific form of rhetoric that is used in order to elicit a coordinating and specific response, specific reaction, specific influence over ideas and attitudes. So pause if there are questions. The category of rhetoric and the classified types of rhetorical appeal. And then we'll move forward to look at the way rhetoric and rhetorical appeal functions. So it's all about style and presentation, not just what we say, but how we say it. In language, this happens, most overtly when writers will rely on connotative, suggestive, or implicit subtext, deeper meaning. And the main structures are authoritative expertise, appealing to emotional connections, and logical reasoning. That's that ethos, pathos, and logos. Rhetoric can also be expressed in imagery, whether it is figurative language, and this is where we use words again to compose detailed descriptions, analogies, or metaphors that influence the audience, or literal visual imagery, so pictures that are seen, video clips that are seen, diagrams, charts, so how we use images to influence the audience. Tone. So again, in language, in written language, which is the majority of what we study in academics, we use tone and word choice as a way to filter our commentary. So the suggestive layers of connotations that are sort of implied by our word choice can influence the attitude or understanding of the audience. Also, if we're studying a text that has audio-video components, tone can refer to the spoken into intonations, so the way the speaker emphasizes their voice. It can also, if we're looking at image-based text, tone can be implied by the actual filter. So if it's like a dark, moody image, or if it's a bright, high contrast type of image, it can connotate a different kind of tone. And then finally, gesture. So this is something that is a little abstract in terms of when we're talking about written text, but we might be able to think about layout and format as a means of gesture in the written context. So how we segment our paragraphs, how we use longer or shorter sentences, the blank spaces that are incorporated on a page. So how we present the written document can influence the reader's attitudes and reception of what we're reading. And then, of course, more obviously, if we're reading something, studying something that has a video type component or images, we can interpret body language, facial expression, and things like that to infer the deeper underlying subtext meaning. Sorry, I'm recording this voiceover today and I'm still recovering from the cold that I've been having, so we're not firing on all cylinders quite yet, but we're doing the best we can. So pause here if you've got questions, thoughts. These concepts and ideas are abstract, complicated, detailed ways of expanding how we think about rhetoric and rhetorical technique, thinking about not just what we say, but how we say it, not just what we read, but how those messages are conveyed to us as the audience. When we're ready to move on, we'll take a look at the three basic appeals, the types of rhetorical appeals. These come from Aristotle's philosophy of rhetoric. It's been around for since 400 BCE, so over 2,000 years now, and we're still teaching and using these same concepts. Basically, Aristotle advocates that rhetorical appeals can be classified into three basic categories. We might be familiar with these already: ethos, pathos, and logos. In this class, we're just going to recalibrate our understanding of these three terms and get warmed up for looking for these details in the research that we're going to do during the semester. So jumping in, first of all, I like to begin with appeals to ethos. This is a rhetorical technique where the writer or the speaker seeks to influence and persuade the audience by appealing to a sense of authority, credibility, and expertise. Appeals to ethos are not appeals to ethics, morality, or justice. This is a common misunderstanding because it's a cognate, or it's a word that sounds similar to ethics. Instead, if that was our previous assumption about appeals to ethos, we do need to do our best to delete that misconception. Maybe it can help if we understand the root word. So historically, the term ethos refers to character. So the character, personality, or I don't know another word for this, persona of the speaker or a writer. And historically, this term ethos or character asks us to evaluate whether or not this person who is speaking is a reliable source of information. So evaluating this person's, right to speak about this topic. The term ethos is not asking us to evaluate whether or not the claims are moral or ethical. So take a moment. If you need, pause the video and do a little bit of cognitive exercise, like shake that Etch-a-Sketch that you have in your brain and erase if you happen to be coming into this course under the misconception that ethos is an appeal to ethics. Rewrite that now and remember that ethos is an appeal to credibility, authority, and expertise. And then let's move on to take a look at how we can look for appeals to ethos when we read. So when we see references to or citations from professionals, experts, and witnesses. Also, when we're reading for appeals to ethos, we might notice the author relying on their background or their life experience to illustrate their expertise, to illustrate their authority on the topic. This is what we did in project number 1. When we were unpacking our viewpoint, we were relying on our own background experience to illustrate our own credibility. And then a little precaution as we're evaluating sources and evaluating rhetorical appeals, we must bear in mind that the appeals to ethos are most valuable for topics where subjective opinion is central to understanding the issues. So in this course, in project number 2 and 3, we really want to explore diverse perspectives, opinions, and experiences that connect with our topic. And in that kind of mission, the appeals to ethos, credibility, expertise, validity that come from relevant professionals, experts, and witnesses, relevant experiences and background knowledge are going to be helpful for us to understand how this topic plays out in the real world. And then similarly, as we are writers, we want to be able to appeal to ethos in our own writing. So the number one way that we do that is integrating direct supporting evidence from relevant sources, because this can provide context and support when it comes to advancing our own arguments. So using evidence that validates, verifies, and adds credibility to our viewpoint. Another way that we can write by expressing our appeals to credibility, validity, and authority is by completely unpacking the layers of meaning in the evidence and details that you share. By giving close attention to evidence, assumptions, and consequences, you're demonstrating to the reader that you have conducted careful, methodical thinking about the claims that you're making. And then also linking out your ideas to those critical lenses and larger contexts demonstrates that you've conducted a sophisticated interpretation and analysis of your topic. So pretty much when you are writing with an appeal to ethos, you want to show your work. You want to show the reader that you are, academically and intelligently invested in the argument that you're making, that you're not just throwing this argument together as quickly as you can, but that you have thought deeply about it for a sustained period of time. So finally, for ethos, what does this mean for us? Well, as readers, evaluating appeals to ethos asks us to think critically about how a text appeals to credibility, and to think critically about how that technique, so the reference to experts and quotations from reputable sources or allusions to background context, how that technique influences our willingness to accept or to question the claims that are presented. And then as we are evaluating our own work as writers, we want to appeal to ethos to convince our readers that we have arrived at valid and meaningful understandings of the issue by dealing fairly and comprehensively with the existing perspectives that are out there. So let's take a moment to pause here, glance down at your notes, think about the topic that you're researching, the writing that you plan to do, and share if you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or ideas about evaluating the appeal to ethos. When we're ready to move on, let's take a look at appeal to pathos. So appeal to pathos is a rhetorical technique where the speaker or writer intends to influence and persuade the audience by appealing to a sense of emotions, values, and beliefs. So this is where we will find appeals to morality, ethics, and justice. We can understand the history of the root word. Etymologically, the word pathetic had been used to signify any relation to emotions in general. Of course, now pathetic is connected to the idea of pity, but in the historical language of the term pathos, it applies to the full range of emotions. So joy, hope, optimism, fear, anger, hatred, pessimism, apathy, disinterest. So a full range of emotions, values, and beliefs. And of course, ethics and morality are closely tied to values and beliefs, which, as we all know, values and beliefs are also quite closely tied to our emotional responses. So let's take a look at writing, reading, and understanding the appeal to pathos. More or less, it is a persuasive technique that relies on carefully chosen symbols that maximize connotative meaning. So symbols can be, as we introduced at the start of the lesson, words, images, gestures, things like that. And the connotative meaning are those underlying, suggested, inferred tone or attitude that is attached to terminology. So writers who are careful with their appeals to pathos develop a sensitivity to the emotional power of language, and they use this emotional power to target their audience. And remember, pathos appeals to that full range of emotions, desires, beliefs, fears, hopes, etc. When we talk about the differences between the denotation and the connotation, the denotation is that surface level, like dictionary, objective meaning of the word, whereas the connotation is that specific, culturally conditioned or socially, emotionally relevant meaning that is carried by that word. So when we have a careful choice of symbolism to maximize connotative meaning, it means that we choose our words carefully to elicit those deeper layers of meaning and emotional response to the topic. And we do so in order to encourage our readers to adopt specific attitudes, bias, perspective, to sort of shift and manipulate their emotional response to the text. All in all, the appeal to pathos is that technique that helps readers to react with their heart rather than their head. So let's take a look at what that means for us as critical readers, critical writers. So evaluating the appeals to pathos asks us to think critically about how a text appeals to emotion, morality, or sentiment, and asks us to think critically about how those techniques influence our willingness to either accept or question the perspective that's being advanced. And then similarly, as writers, when we're evaluating our own techniques of appeal to pathos, we need to decide carefully whether we want to replicate the common techniques of pathos or resist them. So after we do our research, we will notice certain repeated patterns of emotional connotations, connotative language, or symbol use. So on the surface level, we do want to report back to our readers in the annotated bibliography. We want to let people know what kinds of appeals they should expect to find circulating within the discourse that we're studying. And when we take on our own arguments, we want to decide whether we're going to persist in those types of appeals or whether we want to shift the tone and attitude of the conversation. So take a look back at your notes for the appeal to pathos, and let's pause here to see if we have any questions, thoughts, ideas, if anybody would like to add to these lesson materials or ask questions for deeper exploration. And when we're ready to move on, we're going to take a look at the appeal to logos. So the appeal to logos is a rhetorical technique that seeks to influence and persuade the audience by appealing to a sense of validity, reasoning, and proof. Appeals to valid reasoning and proof use concrete evidence and relevant examples that are explicitly connected to the claim. So the appeal to logos is the most common type of rhetorical appeal in academia, and it is sustained by this very transparent and thorough demonstration of the thinking process. So using reasoning, commentary to show your reader how you have developed your thought process from point A to B. So explicitly walking your reader hand in hand through your thought process. There are some common techniques for tracing the thinking pattern. So we want to make sure that our claims, reasoning, evidence, unpacking, and analysis are clearly explained to the reader. So firstly, we want to introduce a clear claim. This is the conclusion, observation, or findings that seem to focus and unite your understanding of the topic. So after doing your research throughout the annotated bibliography, you will kind of arrive at some core focus claims or some core focus questions, arguments, disagreements. And when you're showing the reader, when you're reporting back to the reader, you want to just clearly introduce what those findings and observations are. Then you want to explain the reasoning. So if you noticed a common thread across all of your research, you want to kind of package that up neatly and synthesize those details that circulate around that claim. So noticing this is a common question that seems to be foregrounded in the discourse community that I'm researching. And then you might say, for example, these 3 or 4 sources seem to be guided by this founding question. So synthesizing major details, synthesizing a collection of sources that help you to illustrate that claim. Then you want to provide direct evidence. So you've sort of introduced your conclusion, you've told the reader kind of what collection of details or what collection of sources they can look to find that claim that you're making. And now you want to give specifics. So moving from general to specific, you'd like to share direct examples, quotations, images that illustrate and validate that generalization from claims to reasoning. So going from general to specific. And then you want to show your deep thinking. So again, guiding the reader so that they can follow the thought process that you yourself have taken 6 weeks to come up with. You want your reader to follow it in a single paragraph. So you share your direct evidence, and then you dive deeper. You unpack that evidence so that you can help guide the reader to see that evidence through your eyes. So in the unpacking process, you want to kind of infer the values and the norms that are embedded within this discussion. And this logical structure and this logical pattern will influence which pieces of evidence you choose, because you want those pieces of evidence to signify the values and norms that you want to touch on. And after you've done some unpacking, you want to bring it out to the larger level. So we have given our claim, which is kind of like our observation, our reflection about the research discourse. We've summarized a little bit what kinds of sources, what kinds of details we can look to validate and support that claim. We've shared direct evidence. We've done a deep dive to unpack the meaning of that evidence. And now we want to look outward and expand and extend the significance of this discussion to talk about the consequences or predictions that you're making using your independent, critical, and creative thinking about why this claim matters in a larger context or to specific groups. So it's a complicated process that I'm trying to boil down into these series of steps that we can take to show the logical connections between the thought process, trying to sort of capture a complex, messy, difficult thinking exercise into the demonstration of a PowerPoint infographic. Definitely makes it seem easier said than done. Because when we're developing these ideas, it's a lot of back and forth, partial, unfinished ideas, questions, assumptions. But when we actually come to the writing process, to write our findings in a logical style, I think following these pathways is the most effective way to guide the reader back through the process of your thinking and help them see the connections between one idea and the other. So we're trying to clarify the relationships between claims, reasons, evidence, assumptions, and consequences. And we have some common patterns of reasoning that we can use. Compare and contrast, cause and effect, counterpoint or concession, conditional reasoning, process and sequence reasoning, exemplification, restatement, repetition. So we have some techniques and patterns that we can use to emphasize the logical relationships between details in our work. For this part of the lesson, you will have this slide, and then you'll also have a supplemental handout with more techniques. So one way to reveal the logical structure of your claims is to compose your claim in a phrase that is a complex, sophisticated statement that really uses carefully chosen conjunction words or transition words. And the transition words are, closely connected to expressing the type of logical process you want to demonstrate. So in this slide handout, you'll see different logical structures like compare, contrast, cause, effect, conditional reasoning, time or sequence analysis, addition, so adding, restating, exemplification, so giving examples, and then if you have analysis and thinking processes that are related to place and space. In addition to this, you'll have another handout from a chart from the Excelsior online writing lab that shows other types of conjunction and transition words, often called signal phrases or signal words. So I'm providing a large bank of conjunctions and transitions that we can use to help guide the reader hand in hand through our thinking process. So let's reflect a little bit on the appeal to logos. So as readers, when we are evaluating appeals to logos, we want to understand the logical connections of the arguments that we read, watch, listen to. And the best way to do this is by retracing or deconstructing the patterns of reasoning that appear in that argument. And we do this most often during summary and paraphrase. If we are able to summarize the argument or paraphrase the author's thesis or claim using these conjunction words that show and illustrate patterns of reasoning, we can best understand how that source is appealing to logos. Then also as writers, we want to clarify and explain the logical connections between our own claim, reasoning, evidence, when we unpack the assumptions of that evidence, when we extend the consequences of that claim. We want to guide the reader step by step through our thought process by using transition words along the way. So take a look back at your notes, things that you've written down, questions, thoughts, ideas, especially if you want to share out your own understanding of logos, your own understanding of logical patterns, transition words, so that we as a class can build upon this lesson. Let's pause and take some time to do that. Again, if you were absent or if you're reviewing this lesson for further study, you can use the discussion space in Canvas and I will respond to you when I'm able. And then when we're finished, let's just finally wrap up with a reflection on what does this all mean for us, the idea of rhetoric and rhetorical appeals. So as critical readers, understanding rhetorical strategies can help us tune in to our responses to a text. It helps us develop curiosity about the author's own context, the emotional reactions that we have to the content, why we agree or disagree with certain ideas. As critical readers, we don't want to ignore or dismiss those moments of curiosity, response, or reaction. Instead, when those moments appear, we want to use them to slow down and ask about the rhetorical situation of this text. So that interaction between the audience, the purpose, and the content. So thinking about what audience does this author seem to be addressing? Who do they have in mind when they're sort of choosing their rhetorical strategies and appealing to different layers of ethos, logos, pathos? How does this text connect with certain lifestyles, biases, or assumptions that might seem to be specific to a certain generation or social group or political group? Looking for those demonstrations of bias. Thinking if this text has a feeling about how the audience is supposed to react. Most often when we're doing our research into perspectives, arguments, viewpoints, and opinions, we're not going to get a lot of neutral, bland, apathetic sources. We will often see sources that are using rhetorical appeals. So we can sort of ask ourselves to think critically about the inferred audience of this text. Who is this text written for? And then also we can infer what we think the purpose of this text is. So why did this author write this at all? Were they sort of targeting a specific social or political motive? Maybe the author just wants to share out their experience. Maybe they want to critique a problem that they've noticed. Maybe they want to use their source as a space to ponder, philosophize about certain events, ideals, or values that they are noticing. And then thinking also about the purpose of the source. Does this author seem to wish to maintain the status quo, change or transform it in some way? So using our response to the text to pause at moments of the text and ask ourselves about that rhetorical situation, the interactions between the content that we're reading, the audience that we're expected to be, and the purpose this author seems to have for writing this source. And then finally, as always, keeping an eye on our purpose as critical writers. We want to think about the rhetorical situation when we're writing as well. Tuning into what our expectations are for the audience we are writing for. Predict maybe what we think the audience might know, think, or feel about the topic. And then choose rhetorical techniques that will appeal to them. For this essay, our class is our audience. So we already have a little bit of an idea about our audience expectations from the asking around discussion that we did at the start of project number 2. And we can use that information to sort of glean the pre-existing bias, questions, knowledge base. And that can help us understand how much information, persuasion, etc. we need when we're advancing our own argument during project number 3. For project number 2, when we're doing the annotated bibliography, we want to write for an audience that is generally educated about society and culture, but we have to assume that our audience has not thought deeply about the topic that we are discussing. We are gaining expertise in our focused research topic. And, of course, the opportunity cost to that is that we are not gaining expertise in everybody else's focused research topic. So we need to bear that in mind. We're kind of going to be in a little bit of a thought bubble, really hyper-focused on one topic, one issue, one debate, while the rest of our classmates are going to be in their own different bubbles. So we need to keep that in mind and not take things for granted during the annotated bibliography. When we're summarizing the argument or the perspective, when we're summarizing the evidence, the context that appears in each source, we shouldn't take things for granted. And then, as always, we need to keep our purpose in mind. So why are we doing this research? Why are we writing this annotated bibliography? When it comes to project number 3, why are we writing this argument? We are doing this research and writing in order to explore the connections between diverse opinions, experiences, perspectives. We are doing this research and writing to deeply unpack the psychological, social, cultural, political, historical, and aesthetic contexts that have shaped those diverse views, and the contexts that those diverse views influence and act upon. So how they are how they shape the psychological, social, cultural, political, historical, aesthetic context that we live in. So how these different viewpoints impact the real world, and how these contexts in the real world impact the viewpoints, if I could say that as a little bit more of a riddle. So yes, my brain fog is intense, but we have reached the conclusion of this lesson. So please, I fully expect, if you are absent, it's probably because you also are suffering from the cold that is sweeping through town. So your own brain fog coupled with my brain fog is gonna lead to some questions, some clarifications. So please share in the Canvas discussion area and follow up in your research notes. Apply the information from this lesson to evaluate and pay attention to the rhetorical strategies that appear in the sources that you research. Look for examples of credibility and authority. Look for examples of emotional or moral, ethical, justice-based responses. Look for evidence of logical patterns and logical connections. And we will check in about these terms and these concepts each time that we meet throughout the coming weeks. So thank you so much. And with that being said, I will see you all next time I see ya. Bye.